Hello and welcome to the Sleepyhead Geographer. Tonight, we will journey together into the embrace of the Pacific Ocean and uncover the story of coral atolls, rings of life in the middle of the ocean, born of fire, shaped by time, and sustained by coral dreams. We'll follow their journey from volcanic birth to slow sinking, from fragile growth to magnificent rebirth. Along the way, we'll step inside lagoons where ancient rhythms still flow and see how these delicate worlds, isolated in vast oceans, flourish with life as rich as rainforests. This is more than science. It's a gentle voyage through transformation, where even the tiniest beings leave monuments that outlast civilizations. So let's begin our journey to these rings of life, where volcanoes sleep beneath coral gardens, and every wave carries a story of deep time and wonder. Our story begins not with coral, but with fire. Deep beneath the Pacific Ocean floor, in chambers of molten rock that exist in temperatures hot enough to melt steel, the first chapters of atoll formation are written in flame and pressure. Here, in the Earth's mantle, superheated rock moves in slow, eternal currents, carrying with it the raw materials for islands yet to be born. Imagine, if you can, a plume of magma rising through 60 miles of solid rock. This isn't a quick journey. The molten material, driven by forces beyond human comprehension, pushes upward through the oceanic crust with the patience of geological time. Years pass. Decades. Centuries. The magma plume continues its inexorable rise toward the seafloor, carrying with it the future foundation of an atoll. When this column of liquid fire finally breaches the ocean floor, it creates one of nature's most spectacular displays. Miles beneath the surface, where sunlight has never penetrated and water pressure would crush any human instantly, underwater volcanoes erupt in silent, alien beauty. The water here is so deep and the pressure so intense that the lava doesn't explode as it would on land. Instead, it forms strange, bulbous shapes called pillow lavas, rounded forms that look eerily like cushions made of stone. But our volcanic mountain doesn't stop at the seafloor. Fed by its deep mantle source, it continues to grow. Eruption after eruption builds the volcanic cone higher and higher. What began as a small mound on the abyssal plain slowly transforms into an underwater mountain. The process takes thousands of years, but in geological terms, this is rapid construction. Eventually, after countless eruptions, the growing volcano approaches the surface. The water becomes shallower, the pressure less intense. Now, when eruptions occur, they create different types of lava flows, more violent explosions. Steam and gas blast toward the surface as seawater meets molten rock in tremendous hissing encounters. Then comes the moment of birth. The volcanic cone finally breaks the ocean's surface, creating the first dry land in what may have been thousands of miles of open ocean. Steam clouds billow into the tropical sky as lava meets air for the first time. The new island is raw, black, and completely lifeless. Its shores are sharp volcanic glass. Its slopes are fields of cooling lava. No plant grows here, no animal walks its beaches. It is a blank slate, waiting for life to find it. But life, as we know, is remarkably persistent. Within months, the first seeds arrive, carried by winds from distant lands or in the guts of migrating birds. Coconut palms establish themselves along beaches, their seeds having floated for thousands of miles across the Pacific. Ferns find purchase in volcanic cracks. Gradually, the black slopes begin to show touches of green. Meanwhile, something even more important is happening beneath the waves. The volcanic island, now stable and permanent, creates conditions that marine life finds irresistible. The shallow waters around the island warm quickly in tropical sunlight. Nutrients from the volcanic rock leach into the sea. Most importantly, the sloping sides of the underwater mountain provide the perfect foundation for a very special type of creature. Coral larvae, tiny as dust specks, drift on ocean currents from established reefs that may be hundreds of miles away. These microscopic wanderers are searching for hard surfaces where they can settle and begin their transformation from free-swimming larvae into sessile polyps. The rocky shores of our new volcanic island provide exactly what they need. The first corals to settle around the island are usually the hardiest species, those that can tolerate the somewhat disturbed conditions near an active volcanic system. They cement themselves to the underwater rocks and begin the slow process of building calcium carbonate skeletons. Each polyp is tiny, but collectively they start to create the foundation of what will eventually become one of Earth's most spectacular ecosystems. These pioneer corals don't work alone. Soon they're joined by coralline algae, marine plants that also deposit calcium carbonate and help bind the growing reef structure together. Fish arrive, first the hardiest species that can tolerate the relatively barren conditions, then gradually more specialized species, as the reef ecosystem develops complexity. Years pass, and the reef grows both upward and outward from the island's shores. What started as a few scattered coral colonies gradually develops into a continuous fringing reef, completely encircling the volcanic island. This reef creates a lagoon between itself and the shoreline, a protected area of shallow water where even more marine life can flourish. The volcanic island at this stage is in its prime. It may rise several thousand feet above sea level, with lush tropical vegetation covering its slopes. Streams carry fresh water from volcanic heights to the sea. The fringing reef protects the coastline from ocean waves, creating calm lagoons perfect for marine nurseries. If humans existed at this time and could visit such an island, they would find it a tropical paradise of stunning beauty. But even as the island reaches its peak of beauty and biological diversity, the forces that created it are already beginning to change. The volcanic hotspot that gave birth to the island continues its work, but the Pacific plate carrying the island is constantly moving. Slowly, inexorably, the island moves away from its source of volcanic activity. As the island moves away from the hotspot, volcanic activity begins to decrease. Fewer eruptions mean less new rock added to the island's foundation. More importantly, the island begins to cool. As it cools, it becomes denser and heavier. The seafloor beneath it, no longer heated and expanded by magma, begins to contract and subside. This subsidence is extremely slow by human standards, measured in mere inches per century, but it's relentless and irreversible. The island that took millions of years to build above sea level begins its equally long journey back beneath the waves. This is where the story becomes truly magical, because even as the land disappears, life finds a way to continue the construction project, using entirely different materials and methods. The corals around the island's shore face a critical challenge. They need sunlight to survive, which means they must stay in shallow water. But their foundation, the island itself, is slowly sinking away from the sun. The corals respond in the only way they can. They grow upward, building new generations of reef on top of older generations, staying always in the zone where sunlight can penetrate and sustain them. This begins the transformation from a simple fringing reef around a volcanic island into something far more remarkable. As the island sinks and the reef grows upward, the lagoon between reef and shore gradually deepens and widens. The reef itself moves farther from the shrinking coastline, eventually becoming what we call a barrier reef, separated from the island by a substantial lagoon. At this stage, the system has become a delicate balance between destruction and creation, between sinking land and rising reef. The volcanic foundation continues its slow descent toward the abyss, while the coral construction crew works tirelessly to maintain their position in the sunlit zone. It's a race between geological subsidence and biological growth, played out over millions of years. The volcanic island, once tall and proud, begins to show signs of its fate. Erosion, no longer balanced by fresh volcanic activity, starts to wear down the mountain peaks. Streams carry volcanic sediments to the sea. The island grows smaller and lower with each passing millennium, even as the coral reef around it grows larger and more complex. This is the setup for one of nature's most remarkable transformations. We have a sinking island surrounded by a growing reef, a stage set for the birth of an atoll. But the final act of this geological drama is still millions of years in the future, and the corals have much work to do before their perfect ring can be completed. In 1835, aboard the HMS Beagle, a young naturalist named Charles Darwin encountered something that would puzzle him for years. As the ship sailed through the Pacific, Darwin observed coral formations unlike anything he had seen before. There were fringing reefs hugging the shores of volcanic islands, barrier reefs separated from land by deep lagoons, and most mysteriously of all, perfect rings of coral rising from the deep ocean with no land in sight. These coral rings, called atolls by the native peoples of the Maldives, presented Darwin with a fascinating puzzle. How could corals, which everyone knew required shallow water and sunlight to survive, create such massive structures in the middle of deep ocean basins? The mathematics simply didn't work. Atolls often rose from seafloors thousands of feet deep, yet corals couldn't live much below 150 feet beneath the surface. Darwin spent countless hours pacing the deck of the Beagle, watching these coral formations pass by, turning the problem over in his mind like a complex mathematical equation with missing variables. The traditional explanations of the time suggested that atolls grew on underwater mountains that happened to be at just the right depth. But Darwin's sharp observational skills noticed patterns that didn't fit this simple explanation. During quiet evenings in his cabin, by the light of oil lamps that swayed with the ship's movement, Darwin began sketching diagrams and forming hypotheses. He noticed that coral formations seemed to follow a predictable pattern. Near young, tall volcanic islands, he observed fringing reefs. Around older, smaller islands, he saw barrier reefs with wider lagoons. And in areas where no islands existed at all, he found atolls, perfect rings of coral enclosing turquoise lagoons. The breakthrough came to Darwin not through observing corals, but through his geological studies of South America. During the Beagle's long journey along the South American coast, he had become fascinated by evidence of land that had risen and fallen over geological time. He saw marine fossils high in the Andes and evidence of beaches that had been lifted far above current sea level. If land could rise, Darwin reasoned, it could also sink. The idea was revolutionary for its time, when most geologists believed in a stable, unchanging Earth. But Darwin had seen too much evidence to dismiss the possibility of large-scale vertical movements of the Earth's crust. This insight became the key that unlocked the mystery of coral atolls. Sitting in his cramped cabin one tropical evening, Darwin conceived what would become one of geology's most elegant theories. He imagined a volcanic island in its prime, surrounded by a fringing reef. As the island slowly subsided, sinking gradually beneath the waves, the corals would face a life-or-death challenge. They needed to stay in shallow water to survive, but their foundation was disappearing into the depths. Darwin's genius was in recognizing that corals could solve this problem through growth. As the island sank, the corals would grow upward, always maintaining their position in the sunlit waters near the surface. Over immense periods of time, the island would sink completely beneath the waves, but the coral growth would continue, creating a ring of living rock around the spot where the island had been. The beauty of Darwin's theory was that it explained not just atolls, but the entire sequence of coral reef formation. A young volcanic island would have a fringing reef close to its shores. As the island began to subside, the reef would grow upward and outward, becoming a barrier reef separated from the shrinking island by an ever-widening lagoon. Finally, when the island disappeared completely beneath the waves, only the coral ring would remain, forming a perfect atoll. Darwin spent years developing this theory, corresponding with other naturalists and gathering evidence from around the world. He studied reports from coral reef regions he had never visited, analyzed depth soundings from around atolls, and examined the geological structure of coral formations wherever possible. Every piece of evidence seemed to support his subsidence theory. The implications of Darwin's theory extended far beyond coral reefs. He was proposing that large areas of the Earth's crust could rise and fall over geological time, an idea that challenged fundamental assumptions about the stability of the planet. He suggested that entire ocean basins might be regions of subsidence, while continents represented areas of uplift. In 1842, Darwin published The Structure and Distribution of Coral Reefs, presenting his theory to the scientific world. The book was met with both admiration and skepticism. Many scientists were impressed by the elegance of the theory and its ability to explain diverse coral formations with a single mechanism. Others questioned whether such large-scale crustal movements were really possible. One of the most compelling aspects of Darwin's theory was its predictive power. If atolls were indeed the final stage of a subsiding volcanic island, then drilling down through an atoll should reveal the volcanic foundation beneath. But the technology to test this prediction wouldn't exist for another century. Darwin also predicted that the thickness of coral growth should correspond to the amount of subsidence that had occurred. Areas that had subsided more should have thicker accumulations of coral limestone. This too would require advanced drilling technology to verify. But Darwin was confident in his deductions. The theory explained peculiarities that had puzzled earlier observers. Why were atolls found mainly in certain parts of the Pacific? Darwin suggested these were regions where the seafloor was actively subsiding. Why were some atolls larger than others? Different amounts of subsidence and different rates of coral growth, he reasoned. Perhaps most remarkably, Darwin's theory explained the perfect circular or oval shape of most atolls. If corals were simply growing on underwater mountains of random shape, the resulting reefs should be equally random in form. But if atolls represented the final stage of circular fringing reefs that had grown around volcanic islands, their ring-like shape made perfect sense. Darwin's correspondence reveals his excitement about the theory and his confidence in its correctness. In letters to fellow scientists, he described the subsidence theory as one of his proudest intellectual achievements. He saw it as an example of how careful observation, combined with theoretical reasoning, could unlock nature's deepest secrets. The theory also revealed Darwin's growing appreciation for the power of small, gradual changes accumulating over vast periods of time. Just as he would later argue that species evolved through tiny modifications over millions of years, his coral reef theory showed how massive geological structures could result from the accumulated growth of microscopic organisms over equally long periods. Critics of the time pointed out that the theory required enormous timescales to work. The amount of subsidence needed to create large atolls, combined with the slow rate of coral growth, meant that the oldest atolls might be millions of years old. In Darwin's time, when many still believed the Earth was only thousands of years old, this was a controversial implication. But Darwin was undeterred by the timescale problem. His geological observations had already convinced him that the Earth was far older than commonly believed. The coral reef theory simply provided another line of evidence for the planet's great antiquity. He saw this as a strength of the theory, not a weakness. Modern science has largely vindicated Darwin's insights, though with important refinements. We now know that his basic mechanism of subsidence and upward coral growth is correct, even if some details needed modification. Drilling projects in the 20th century found volcanic foundations beneath major atolls, exactly as Darwin predicted. The theory also prepared Darwin for his later work on evolution. The idea that small, gradual changes could produce dramatic results over long periods became central to his thinking about biological change. The patient, persistent growth of coral polyps building massive atolls provided a perfect analogy for how species might gradually transform over geological time. Looking back, Darwin's coral reef theory represents one of the finest examples of scientific reasoning in the 19th century. Based on limited observations and no direct evidence of the processes involved, Darwin constructed a theory that was both elegant and correct. It demonstrated the power of careful observation combined with bold theoretical thinking. To understand how tiny coral polyps can create structures visible from space, we must first journey into the microscopic world where individual coral animals live and work. Each coral polyp is no larger than a rice grain, yet collectively, these creatures have built some of the largest biological structures on Earth. Their story is one of remarkable cooperation between animal and plant, between individual organisms and vast ecosystems. Let's begin our exploration by floating gently down to a coral reef in its early stages of growth. The water here is crystal clear, warm as a tropical bath, and alive with gentle currents that bring both food and oxygen to the countless creatures living in this underwater city. As we approach the reef, we see what appears to be a colorful underwater garden, but this garden is actually composed of animals. Each coral colony starts with a single polyp, a tiny animal that looks somewhat like a miniature sea anemone. This founding polyp has traveled here as a larva, drifting on ocean currents until it found this suitable spot to call home. When it settles, it immediately begins one of nature's most remarkable construction projects. The polyp extends its soft body and begins secreting calcium carbonate from its base, creating a small, cup-shaped skeleton called a corallite. This skeleton is not just a home, but a foundation for future generations. The polyp sits in this limestone cup like a flower in a vase, its tentacles waving in the current to capture tiny floating organisms and particles of organic matter. But the real magic of coral biology lies in a partnership that has existed for millions of years. Living within the tissues of each coral polyp are millions of microscopic algae called zooxanthellae. These single-celled plants are the secret to the coral's success, and their relationship with the coral polyp is one of nature's most perfect examples of mutualism. During the day, these zooxanthellae photosynthesize just like plants on land, using sunlight to convert carbon dioxide and water into sugars and oxygen. They share much of this food with their coral host, providing up to 90% of the coral's nutritional needs. In return, the coral provides the algae with a safe home and the carbon dioxide they need for photosynthesis. This partnership explains why coral reefs exist only in shallow, clear water. The algae need sunlight to photosynthesize, which means corals can only thrive where enough light penetrates the water. It also explains the brilliant colors of healthy coral reefs. The zooxanthellae contain various pigments that give corals their vibrant hues of yellow, brown, green, pumpkin, and red. As our founding polyp grows and matures, it begins to reproduce through a process called budding. Instead of producing larvae that drift away, it creates identical copies of itself that remain attached to the original skeleton. Each new polyp builds its own corallite connected to those of its siblings, gradually expanding the colony outward and upward. This budding process continues for decades, sometimes centuries. A single coral colony can eventually contain millions of individual polyps, all genetically identical, all working together to build and maintain their shared limestone foundation. The colony takes on characteristic shapes that help us identify different coral species. Brain corals create meandering patterns that resemble the folds of a human brain. Staghorn corals branch like antlers. Table corals form flat platforms that can span dozens of feet. The construction process is remarkably efficient. Each polyp continuously secretes calcium carbonate, extracting the necessary calcium and carbonate ions directly from seawater. The limestone skeleton grows both upward and outward as new polyps are added, and existing polyps expand their corallites. Over time, the colony can reach enormous sizes, with some brain corals growing to over 20 feet in diameter. Different coral species have evolved different growth strategies. Fast-growing corals like staghorn and elkhorn corals can extend several inches per year, quickly colonizing available space and reaching toward sunlight. These corals tend to have relatively fragile skeletons that are vulnerable to storms but allow rapid growth. Slower-growing massive corals like brain corals and star corals may grow only an inch or two per year, but they create incredibly dense, durable skeletons that can withstand hurricanes and persist for centuries. The diversity of coral growth forms creates the three-dimensional structure that makes coral reefs such rich ecosystems. Branching corals provide hiding places for small fish and invertebrates. Massive corals offer solid surfaces for other organisms to grow on. Plate corals create overhangs and caves that shelter creatures preferring shaded environments. This structural complexity is what allows coral reefs to support more species per unit area than any other marine ecosystem. But corals don't work alone in building reefs. They're assisted by many other organisms that also deposit calcium carbonate. Coralline algae, which look more like pink or purple paint than living plants, cement themselves to coral surfaces and help bind the reef structure together. These algae are crucial in areas where waves might otherwise break apart the coral formations. Other reef builders include mollusks like giant clams, which can grow to several feet across and add their massive shells to the reef structure when they die. Certain sponges also deposit calcium carbonate, and even some fish contribute to reef building by producing calcium carbonate sand from digested coral fragments. The process of reef construction involves not just building up, but also constant recycling and reshaping. Parrotfish scrape algae from coral surfaces, inadvertently consuming and grinding up pieces of coral skeleton, which they excrete as fine sand. Boring sponges and clams create holes and tunnels in coral skeletons. Storms break apart coral formations, creating rubble that settles in reef lagoons or gets cemented together by coralline algae to form new substrate. This cycle of construction, destruction, and reconstruction means that coral reefs are incredibly dynamic systems. What appears to be a solid, permanent structure is actually in constant flux, with individual corals dying and being replaced, with reef shapes changing in response to waves and currents, with new species colonizing areas where others have disappeared. The chemistry of coral skeleton formation is itself fascinating. Corals must extract calcium and carbonate ions from seawater and concentrate them to levels high enough to precipitate solid calcium carbonate. They do this by creating specialized spaces within their tissues where they can control the chemical environment. The Atolls process requires significant energy, which explains why the partnership with zooxanthellae is so crucial. Environmental conditions strongly influence coral growth rates and forms. In areas with strong wave action, corals tend to grow in low, sturdy formations that can withstand the pounding. In calmer waters, they may grow in more delicate branching forms that maximize surface area for light capture. Temperature affects growth rates, with most corals growing fastest in water between 77 and 84 degrees Fahrenheit. The seasonal nature of coral growth creates annual bands in the skeleton, much like tree rings. Scientists can analyze these bands to reconstruct past environmental conditions, including water temperature, rainfall patterns, and even major storms. Some massive corals contain growth records spanning hundreds of years, making them valuable archives of climate history. Understanding coral biology helps us appreciate the remarkable feat of atoll construction. Imagine millions of these tiny polyps, generation after generation, building upward as their volcanic foundation slowly sinks away. Each polyp lives only a few months to a few years, but the colony can persist for centuries, continuously adding new growth to maintain its position in the sunlit zone. The biological imperative driving this construction is simple survival. Corals that fail to keep pace with subsidence sink into water too deep for their zooxanthellae to photosynthesize effectively. Those colonies weaken and die, their skeletons becoming foundations for more successful corals above them. Only the fastest-growing, most efficient builders can maintain viable populations, as their world literally sinks away beneath them. This creates intense selective pressure for corals that can maximize growth rates while maintaining strong skeletons. Over millions of years of atoll development, coral communities become increasingly dominated by species that have perfected this balance between speed and strength. The result is the incredibly efficient biological machines that build and maintain modern atolls. The journey from volcanic island to perfect atoll unfolds across millions of years, a transformation so gradual that it's invisible to human observers, but profound in its ultimate results. To understand this metamorphosis, we must learn to think in geological time, where centuries pass like seasons and millennia are mere moments in an epic story of land and sea. Picture our volcanic island at the peak of its glory. It rises perhaps 3,000 feet above sea level, its slopes covered in lush tropical vegetation. Streams cascade down volcanic cliffs, creating waterfalls that tumble into lagoons, protected by the fringing reef that encircles the island's shores. This reef, built by countless coral polyps over thousands of years, forms a protective barrier that calms the waters near shore and creates perfect conditions for marine life to flourish. The island at this stage supports remarkable biological diversity. Seabirds nest in cliff-top colonies, their cries echoing across tropical valleys. Land crabs scuttle through coastal forests, while hermit crabs patrol the beaches. The lagoon teems with fish of every imaginable color and form. Coral gardens in the shallows rival any terrestrial flower garden for beauty and diversity. But even as life flourishes, the forces of change are inexorably at work. The volcanic hotspot that created the island continues its deep, slow burning, but the Pacific Plate carrying the island moves steadily northwest at about 3 inches per year. This might seem insignificantly slow, but over millions of years, it carries the island hundreds of miles away from its volcanic birthplace. As the island moves away from the hotspot, the volcanic activity that built it gradually diminishes. Fewer eruptions mean less new rock being added to the island's foundation. More importantly, the massive volcanic pile begins to cool and contract. The seafloor beneath it, no longer heated and expanded by magma chambers, also begins to settle and subside. This subsidence occurs at a rate of just inches per century, far too slow for any individual observer to notice. But the cumulative effect over geological time is dramatic. The island that took millions of years to build above sea level begins an equally long journey back toward the depths from which it came. The corals surrounding the island face their first major challenge as subsidence begins. These organisms have evolved to live in shallow water where sunlight can penetrate and fuel the photosynthesis of their symbiotic algae. As their rocky foundation slowly sinks, they must grow upward to maintain their position in the life-giving shallows. Fortunately, many coral species are remarkably efficient builders. Staghorn corals can grow upward at rates of 6 inches per year under optimal conditions. Even slower-growing massive corals can add several inches annually to their height. In most cases, healthy coral communities can easily outpace the rate of subsidence, staying comfortably in the sunlit zone as their foundation sinks away. As subsidence continues over hundreds of thousands of years, the relationship between island and reef begins to change. The fringing reef that once hugged the shoreline finds itself farther and farther from the gradually shrinking island. What was once a narrow lagoon just a few hundred feet wide slowly expands into a substantial body of water, separating reef from shore. The reef system enters what Darwin called the barrier reef stage. The coral formations now constitute a genuine barrier, protecting the island from ocean waves and storms, while creating an increasingly large lagoon between reef and land. These barrier reefs can extend for miles, following the original outline of the island, but now separated from it by deep, clear lagoons. During this phase, the reef system becomes more complex and diverse. The outer edge faces the full force of ocean waves and supports corals adapted to high-energy environments. The inner lagoon develops its own distinct ecosystem, with different coral species adapted to calmer conditions and different water chemistry. Sand flats, seagrass beds, and patch reefs create a mosaic of habitats within the protected lagoon. Meanwhile, the volcanic island continues its inexorable decline. Erosion, unchecked by new volcanic activity, begins to carve deep valleys and flatten mountain peaks. Streams carry volcanic sediments into the lagoon, where they settle in quiet areas between coral formations. The island's profile becomes lower and more rounded as millions of years of wind and rain wear away the volcanic rock. As the island shrinks and the lagoon expands, the reef must work even harder to maintain its position. The coral colonies on the outer edge grow both upward to match subsidence and outward to maintain a broad enough foundation to withstand ocean waves. The reef structure becomes increasingly massive, with living corals forming just a thin veneer over hundreds of feet of coral limestone built by previous generations. This process continues for millions of years, with the balance between subsidence and coral growth determining the reef's success. In areas where subsidence is too rapid or environmental conditions prevent vigorous coral growth, reefs may fail to keep pace and eventually sink below the depths where corals can survive. But in optimal locations, the biological construction crew works tirelessly to maintain their position in the sunlit zone. The transformation enters its most dramatic phase as the volcanic island approaches sea level. After millions of years of erosion and subsidence, the once mighty mountain has been reduced to a low, rounded hill, barely rising above the waves. The lagoon has become a vast oval of clear water, often several miles across and hundreds of feet deep, surrounded by a continuous ring of coral reef. During this critical period, storm waves begin to wash completely over the island during high tides and rough weather. Salt spray kills much of the remaining vegetation, leaving only the most salt-tolerant plants clinging to life on the highest remaining ground. Land animals that cannot fly or swim face extinction as their habitat shrinks to a few square miles of low, occasionally flooded land. Finally, after tens of millions of years, the ultimate transformation occurs. The last remnant of the volcanic island slips beneath the waves during a combination of high tide and storm surge. Where once a mountain rose 3,000 feet into tropical skies, only clear blue water remains. But the coral reef continues its construction project, now forming a complete ring around the spot where the island disappeared. This is the birth of a true atoll. From above, it appears as a perfect circle or oval of shallow coral reef surrounding a deep lagoon of the most brilliant turquoise blue. The reef itself may rise only a few feet above sea level at low tide, but it extends hundreds of feet downward through the coral limestone built by millions of generations of polyps. Far below, sometimes thousands of feet down, lies the original volcanic foundation, now buried beneath eons of coral growth. The transformation from volcanic island to atoll represents one of nature's most remarkable examples of biological construction outpacing geological destruction. The coral polyps have essentially built a biological replacement for the lost island, maintaining a platform for life in the middle of the deep ocean long after the original land disappeared. But the atoll's evolution doesn't end with the disappearance of the central island. The reef continues to grow and change, responding to variations in sea level, climate, and local conditions. During ice ages, when global sea levels drop, parts of the reef may be exposed as dry land, allowing different types of ecosystems to develop. When sea levels rise again, the exposed areas are recolonized by marine life. Wave action and storms constantly reshape the reef structure. Pieces of coral broken off during storms don't simply represent destruction, they become raw material for new growth. Storm debris settles in calm areas of the lagoon, creating new foundations for coral colonization. Some of this material gets cemented together by coralline algae and other organisms, forming solid new reef rock. Over time, sand and coral fragments accumulate in particular areas of the reef, often on the leeward side where wave action is less intense. Accumulations can build up above high tide level, creating small islands called motus or cays. These islands, though tiny and temporary by geological standards, can support terrestrial vegetation and provide nesting sites for seabirds. The formation of these reef islands follows predictable patterns. Storm waves wash coral fragments and sand over the reef flat, depositing them in areas where currents and topography create natural collection points. Over decades or centuries, these deposits build higher, eventually reaching levels that stay dry even at high tide. Pioneer plants like saltgrass and morning glory colonize the new land, their roots helping to stabilize the sandy soil. Coconut palms often establish themselves on these reef islands, their seeds having drifted across hundreds or thousands of miles of ocean. Birds contribute to island ecosystems by bringing seeds in their guts and by depositing guano that fertilizes the poor coral sand soils. Over time, even these tiny islands can support surprisingly diverse communities of plants and animals. The cyclical nature of atoll development means that these systems are constantly balancing creation and destruction. Storms that devastate coral communities in one area may create new habitat in another. Rising sea levels that threaten existing reef islands may also provide new shallow areas for coral expansion. The key to atoll survival is the ability to adapt and rebuild, maintaining the essential structure while allowing for constant change in detail. Some atolls develop complex internal structures as they mature. Patch reefs grow up from the lagoon floor, creating a network of coral formations within the main ring. Channels cut by tidal flow or storms create passages through the reef, allowing water exchange between lagoon and ocean. These channels are crucial for lagoon health, bringing in fresh seawater and nutrients while flushing out wastes. The biological processes driving atoll formation also create remarkable geological records. Deep drilling into established atolls reveals layer upon layer of coral limestone, each layer representing a different period in the atoll's history. These cores show evidence of past sea level changes, climate variations, and evolutionary changes in coral communities spanning millions of years. As atolls mature, they may eventually face new challenges. Continued subsidence can outpace coral growth if environmental conditions deteriorate. Changes in climate or ocean chemistry can stress coral communities, reducing their ability to build reef structure. Some ancient atolls that failed to keep pace with environmental changes now lie submerged as flat-topped seamounts hundreds of feet beneath the surface, ghostly reminders of reef systems that once thrived in the sunlight. The timescales involved in atoll formation help put human impacts in perspective. These systems have survived ice ages, volcanic eruptions, massive storms, and dramatic changes in sea level over millions of years. Yet they depend ultimately on the health of tiny coral polyps and their algal partners, organisms that can be stressed by even small changes in water temperature, chemistry, or clarity. Understanding the deep time perspective of atoll formation reveals both the resilience and vulnerability of these systems. They are incredibly persistent, able to rebuild from massive destruction and adapt to changing conditions over geological time. But they are also dependent on specific environmental conditions that allow coral growth to continue. The same biological processes that built these magnificent structures over millions of years continue today, still racing to stay ahead of the slowly sinking sea floor, still dependent on the ancient partnership between animal and plant that makes their existence possible. Within the protective embrace of the coral ring lies one of Earth's most enchanting environments, the atoll lagoon. This is a world apart from both the turbulent open ocean and the wave-battered reef crest, a place where time seems to move more slowly and life follows rhythms established over millions of years. As we glide into these protected waters, we enter a realm where crystal clarity meets infinite blue, where every grain of sand has a story to tell. The lagoon exists in a state of perpetual twilight blue, its waters so clear that sunlight penetrates to sandy bottoms 40, 60, sometimes 100 feet below the surface. This extraordinary transparency results from the lagoon's isolation from terrestrial sediments and the filtering action of countless marine organisms that call these waters home. Every drop of water has been purified by passage through coral tissues, sponge canals, and the feeding apparatus of billions of filter-feeding creatures. The temperature here is bath-like, maintained at a constant warmth by tropical sunlight and the thermal mass of the surrounding coral reef. These stable conditions create perfect nursery environments for countless marine species. The water moves in gentle, predictable patterns driven by tides, winds, and the subtle temperature differences between day and night. These currents are rarely strong enough to disturb the sand on the bottom, yet they're sufficient to deliver food and oxygen to every corner of the lagoon. The floor of a mature atoll lagoon tells the story of millions of years of biological activity. What appears to be simple white sand is actually composed almost entirely of the remains of marine organisms. Each grain represents a fragment of coral skeleton, a piece of mollusk shell, the test of a microscopic foraminifera, or the processed remains of algae and other marine plants. This biological sand is constantly being produced and redistributed by the activities of lagoon inhabitants. Parrotfish are among the most important sand producers in the lagoon. These colorful creatures spend their days scraping algae from coral surfaces, inadvertently consuming and grinding up small pieces of coral skeleton in the process. A single large parrotfish can produce over 800 pounds of sand per year, constantly adding new material to the lagoon floor. The sand they create is remarkably pure calcium carbonate, white as fresh snow and fine as flour. The sandy plains of the lagoon might appear empty to a casual observer, but they teem with hidden life. Beneath the seemingly barren surface lives a complex community of burrowing animals. Heart urchins tunnel through the sand, processing organic matter as they move. Bristle worms create intricate burrow systems that can extend several feet down into the sediment. Garden eels establish colonies in sandy areas, their slender bodies swaying in the current like underwater grass as they pluck plankton from the water. Scattered across the lagoon floor like underwater oases, patch reefs create islands of complexity in the sandy desert. These smaller coral formations grow up from the lagoon bottom, never quite reaching the surface, but creating three-dimensional habitats that support different communities than either the sandy flats or the main reef. Patch reefs often specialize in particular types of coral growth, with some dominated by branching staghorn corals, others by massive brain corals, still others by delicate plate corals that form overlapping platforms in the filtered sunlight. The spaces between patch reefs are often carpeted with seagrass beds, underwater meadows that play crucial ecological roles in the lagoon ecosystem. These marine flowering plants, survivors from an age when their ancestors grew on land, have readapted to life beneath the waves. Their long, ribbon-like leaves sway gently in the current, creating habitat for countless small creatures, while their roots help stabilize the sandy sediment. Seagrass beds serve as nurseries for many species that will eventually move out to the main reef or into the open ocean. Young fish find protection among the grass blades, while juvenile sea turtles graze on the tender shoots. The grass beds also act as natural filters, trapping fine sediments and maintaining the crystal clarity of the lagoon water. At night, When photosynthesis stops, these underwater meadows become hunting grounds for nocturnal predators. The water column itself is alive with microscopic organisms that form the base of the lagoon's food web. Phytoplankton, tiny floating plants, photosynthesize in the well-lit waters, converting sunlight and dissolved nutrients into the organic compounds that feed larger organisms. Zooplankton, microscopic animals, graze on the phytoplankton and in turn become food for small fish, coral polyps, and filter-feeding invertebrates. During certain times of year, the lagoon water becomes thick with the larvae of coral, fish, and invertebrates. These seasonal spawning events turn the clear water milky with billions of eggs and sperm, followed by clouds of developing larvae. Most of these young organisms will die, becoming food for other creatures, but the survivors will settle and grow to maintain the lagoon's rich biodiversity. The lagoon's connection to the surrounding ocean occurs through channels and passes in the reef. These passages are dynamic environments where tidal currents create complex flow patterns. During incoming tides, nutrient-rich ocean water flows into the lagoon, bringing food and oxygen to lagoon communities. Outgoing tides flush waste products and carry lagoon-borne larvae out to the open ocean, where they may drift to colonize distant reefs. These channels concentrate marine life in remarkable ways. Sharks patrol the passes, taking advantage of the funnel effect that concentrates prey. Rays glide through on tidal currents, their wing-like fins barely moving as they ride the water flow. Schools of fish use the channels as highways between lagoon and ocean, timing their movements with the tides. The chemistry of lagoon water is subtly different from the surrounding ocean. The enclosed nature of the system allows various biological processes to modify water composition. Photosynthesis by corals, algae, and seagrasses removes carbon dioxide and adds oxygen during the day, while respiration reverses this process at night. The result is a daily cycle of pH and oxygen levels that creates different conditions for marine life throughout the day-night cycle. Calcium carbonate saturation levels in lagoon water are often elevated due to the constant dissolution and reprecipitation of shell and skeleton material. This chemical environment actually promotes the growth of calcium carbonate-secreting organisms, creating a positive feedback loop that enhances the reef-building process. The lagoon becomes a factory for the production of reef material, with ideal conditions for the growth of corals, mollusks, and other shell-bearing creatures. The acoustic environment of the lagoon is unique among marine ecosystems. Protected from the constant crash of waves on the outer reef, lagoon waters are quiet enough to hear the subtle sounds of marine life. The clicking of shrimp, the scraping of parrotfish feeding on corals, the calls of dolphins passing through the channels. All these sounds carry clearly through the dense water. Some fish species have evolved elaborate acoustic communication systems that take advantage of the lagoon's excellent sound transmission properties. Temperature variations within the lagoon create subtle but important microhabitats. Shallow areas near the reef flat warm quickly in morning sunlight and may become several degrees warmer than deeper areas. These thermal variations drive small-scale circulation patterns that distribute nutrients and oxygen throughout the system. Some marine organisms time their daily activities to take advantage of these temperature cycles. The seasonal cycles of the lagoon are tied to larger patterns of ocean circulation and climate. During certain times of year, upwelling in distant parts of the ocean may bring unusual numbers of nutrients to the region, triggering blooms of plankton that temporarily cloud the normally clear lagoon waters. These periodic productivity events provide pulses of food that many lagoon organisms have evolved to exploit. At night, the lagoon transforms into a different world. Many creatures that hide during the day emerge to feed under cover of darkness. Nocturnal coral polyps extend their tentacles to capture plankton. Crabs and lobsters scuttle across the sand, hunting for food. Bioluminescent organisms create trails of light in the water when disturbed, turning every movement into a sparkling display. The lagoon also serves as a refuge during storms. When hurricanes batter the outer reef, the protected waters of the lagoon remain relatively calm. Many mobile marine creatures retreat to lagoon depths during severe weather, waiting out the storm in the safety of the enclosed waters. This refuge function has been crucial to the survival of reef ecosystems through countless storms over millions of years. Understanding the lagoon's role in atoll ecology reveals why these systems are so much more than simple coral rings. The lagoon is an integral part of the atoll ecosystem, providing nursery areas, feeding grounds, refuge habitat, and unique environmental conditions that support specialized communities of marine life. It's a living laboratory where evolution continues to experiment with new forms of life, adapted to this most unusual of aquatic environments. The coral atoll represents one of nature's most successful experiments in biodiversity, creating more species per unit area than almost any other ecosystem on Earth. Within the confines of a coral ring that may measure only a few miles across, thousands of species have found ways to coexist, each filling specialized niches in a complex web of interdependence that has evolved over millions of years. The foundation of this incredible diversity lies in the three-dimensional architecture created by coral growth. Unlike the relatively flat seafloor of the deep ocean, coral reefs create a complex landscape of caves, crevices, overhangs, and channels that provide countless microhabitats. Each species of coral grows in a characteristic form, creating different types of shelter and feeding opportunities for the myriad creatures that call the reef home. Staghorn corals, with their branching antler-like growth, create forests of calcium carbonate that provide protection for small fish and invertebrates. Schools of chromis and wrasses weave between the branches, darting to safety when predators approach. Juvenile fish find perfect nursery conditions in these coral thickets, where they can feed on plankton while remaining hidden from larger fish that cannot navigate the narrow spaces between coral branches. Brain corals, with their massive rounded forms and intricate folded surfaces, offer different opportunities for marine life. The deep valleys in their surfaces collect sediments and organic matter, creating feeding grounds for small crabs, worms, and mollusks. Fish like butterfly fish have evolved elongated snouts perfectly shaped for reaching into coral crevices to extract small invertebrates and algae. Table corals create horizontal platforms that shade the areas beneath them, providing habitat for creatures that prefer lower light conditions. Christmas tree worms burrow into these coral tables, extending their feathery feeding crowns into the water column while keeping their bodies safely hidden in coral bored tubes. At the first sign of danger, they retract instantly into their protective homes with a speed that seems impossible. The reef slope, where the atoll drops away into deep water, supports yet another community of marine life. Here, where sunlight begins to fade and water pressure increases, different species of corals and fish have adapted to these more challenging conditions. Deep-water gorgonians spread their fan-like colonies perpendicular to the current, maximizing their ability to capture food particles from the water. Groupers and snappers patrol these deeper areas, their large eyes adapted to the dimmer light conditions. The diversity of fish species on coral atolls is staggering. A single healthy atoll may support over 1,000 species of fish, ranging from tiny gobies less than an inch long to massive whale sharks that can exceed 40 feet in length. Each species has evolved specific adaptations for life on the reef, creating a kaleidoscope of colors, forms, and behaviors. Cleaner fish have developed one of the most remarkable interspecies relationships in the ocean. Species like cleaner wrasses and gobies have evolved to feed exclusively on parasites and dead tissue from other fish. They establish cleaning stations on the reef where larger fish come to be serviced, often waiting in line like customers at a barber shop. The cleaners advertise their services with bright colors and distinctive swimming patterns, and even the most aggressive predators become docile clients during cleaning sessions. Parrotfish play crucial roles as both grazers and reef architects. Their beak-like mouths, formed from fused teeth, are perfectly designed for scraping algae from coral surfaces. Different species specialize in different types of algae and feed at different depths and locations on the reef. Large parrotfish can live for decades, gradually changing from female to male as they age, with the largest, most colorful males defending territories and harems of smaller females. The invertebrate diversity of atolls is even more remarkable than the fish diversity. Thousands of species of crabs, shrimp, mollusks, worms, echinoderms, and other invertebrates have evolved to exploit every available niche in the reef ecosystem. Many of these creatures remain hidden during the day, emerging only at night to feed and reproduce under cover of darkness. Nudibranches, shell-less sea slugs, represent some of the most beautiful and specialized creatures on the reef. Each species typically feeds on only one or two types of prey, often incorporating the stinging cells or toxins of their prey into their own tissues for defense. Their intricate body forms and brilliant colors make them favorites among underwater photographers. But their incredible diversity, with hundreds of species on a single reef, makes them important indicators of ecosystem health. Giant clams, the largest mollusks in the ocean, can grow to over 4 feet in length and live for more than a century. Like corals, they have formed partnerships with symbiotic algae that provide much of their nutrition through photosynthesis. The brilliant blues, greens, and purples of their mantles come from these algae, and the clams position themselves to maximize sunlight exposure for their photosynthetic partners. Sea turtles use atolls as feeding, resting, and sometimes nesting areas. Green turtles graze on algae and seagrass in lagoons, while hawksbill turtles specialize in feeding on sponges and other invertebrates on the reef slopes. These ancient mariners may travel thousands of miles between feeding and nesting areas, using magnetic navigation and other sensory cues that scientists are still working to understand. Sharks and rays occupy the top levels of the atoll food web, serving as apex predators that help maintain the balance of marine communities. Reef sharks patrol the reef edges and channels, their presence indicating a healthy ecosystem. Different species occupy different niches. Gray reef sharks hunt in the open water around the reef. White-tip reef sharks rest in caves during the day and hunt at night. Blacktip sharks patrol the shallow lagoon areas. Manta rays visit atolls to feed on plankton and to visit cleaning stations where small fish remove parasites from their skin. These gentle giants, with wingspans that can exceed 20 feet, perform graceful underwater ballet as they filter feed in plankton-rich waters. Many atolls have specific areas where mantas congregate regularly, creating reliable opportunities for researchers to study these magnificent creatures. The seasonal cycles of marine life around atolls create spectacular natural phenomena. Many species time their reproduction to take advantage of specific lunar cycles, tidal patterns, or seasonal changes in water temperature. Mass spawning events can turn the water milky with eggs and sperm, creating feeding bonanzas for plankton feeders and setting the stage for the next generation of reef inhabitants. Seabird colonies on atoll islands create important connections between marine and terrestrial ecosystems. Boobies, frigate birds, terns, and other seabirds feed in the waters around atolls but nest on land, depositing nutrient-rich guano that fertilizes the sparse soils of coral islands. This input of marine-derived nutrients allows terrestrial vegetation to flourish and supports land-based food webs that would otherwise be impossible in such isolated locations. The interconnectedness of atoll ecosystems means that changes in one part of the system can cascade through the entire community. The loss of a key species like parrotfish can lead to algae overgrowth that smothers corals. The decline of apex predators can result in population explosions of their prey species, which may then overgraze important reef organisms. These cascade effects demonstrate why protecting the entire ecosystem, rather than individual species, is crucial for atoll conservation. Some of the most remarkable discoveries in marine biology have come from studying the extreme specialists found on coral. Atolls fish that change sex as they age, crabs that farm algae, shrimp that communicate through bioluminescence, worms that build crystal palaces. The diversity of life strategies represented on atolls continues to amaze scientists and reveal new insights into the possibilities of life on Earth. The microbial communities associated with atolls are equally diverse and important. Bacteria and other microorganisms play crucial roles in nutrient cycling, disease resistance in corals, and the processing of organic matter throughout the ecosystem. Recent research has revealed that coral reefs harbor some of the most diverse microbial communities on the planet, with new species being discovered regularly. This incredible biodiversity makes atolls both resilient and vulnerable. The complex web of species interactions means that healthy atolls can recover from disturbances through the compensatory growth of surviving species. However, it also means that disruption of key relationships or the loss of critical species can trigger cascading effects that compromise the entire system. Understanding and protecting this biodiversity is essential for ensuring that these remarkable ecosystems continue to thrive in our changing world. Today, the coral atolls that took millions of years to build face unprecedented challenges in the span of mere decades. These ancient ecosystems, which have survived ice ages, volcanic eruptions, and countless storms, now confront threats that work faster than their natural ability to adapt and recover. The very processes that created and maintained atolls over geological time are being disrupted by changes occurring within single human lifetimes. Climate change presents the most pervasive and complex challenge to atoll ecosystems. As atmospheric carbon dioxide levels rise, two primary effects threaten coral communities: warming ocean temperatures and ocean acidification. Even small increases in water temperature can stress the delicate partnership between coral polyps and their symbiotic algae, causing corals to expel their colorful partners in a process known as coral bleaching. When corals bleach, they appear ghostly white, their calcium carbonate skeletons visible through transparent tissues. Without their algal partners providing food through photosynthesis, corals begin to starve. If stressful conditions persist for too long, bleached corals die, leaving behind only their skeletons as monuments to the partnership that once thrived there. Mass bleaching events, once rare and localized, have become increasingly frequent and widespread, affecting entire atoll systems simultaneously. Ocean acidification, often called the other CO2 problem, occurs as seawater absorbs excess carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, forming carbonic acid that lowers the pH of ocean water. This chemical change makes it more difficult for corals, mollusks, and other organisms to build and maintain their calcium carbonate shells and skeletons. The very process that allowed coral polyps to construct atolls over millions of years becomes increasingly energy-intensive and difficult. Sea level rise, another consequence of climate change, presents a complex challenge for atolls. While these systems have historically responded to sea level changes by growing upward, the rate of current rise may exceed the ability of stressed coral communities to keep pace. Healthy, fast-growing corals can potentially match or exceed current rates of sea level rise, but corals weakened by bleaching, disease, or other stresses may lack the energy for rapid upward growth. The low-lying islands and motus that provide terrestrial habitat on many atolls are particularly vulnerable to sea level rise. These small land areas, rarely more than a few feet above high tide, can be overwashed by storm surges or unusually high tides. Saltwater intrusion into freshwater lenses beneath coral islands threatens the vegetation that helps stabilize these land areas and makes them unsuitable for human habitation. Human activities have introduced additional stresses to atoll ecosystems. Overfishing, particularly the removal of herbivorous fish like parrotfish and surgeonfish, can disrupt the balance between coral and algae. These fish play crucial roles in controlling algae growth on coral surfaces. Without sufficient grazing pressure, algae can overgrow and smother coral polyps. The loss of large predators like sharks also disrupts food web dynamics in ways that can cascade through the entire ecosystem. Pollution from land-based sources affects even the most remote atolls through ocean currents and atmospheric transport. Plastic debris, carried by ocean currents from distant continents, accumulates on atoll beaches and in the water column. Seabirds and marine animals mistake plastic fragments for food, leading to internal injuries, blocked digestive systems, and toxic chemical exposure. Microplastics, invisible to the naked eye, enter the food web at its base and concentrate as they move up through increasingly large organisms. Chemical pollution from agricultural runoff, urban areas, and industrial activities can travel thousands of miles through ocean currents before reaching remote atolls. Pesticides, herbicides, and industrial chemicals can affect coral health, reproduction, and the symbiotic relationships that make coral growth possible. Even in the middle of the Pacific, far from any major population centers, scientists have detected these pollutants in coral tissues and marine organisms. Crown-of-thorns starfish represent a natural threat that has been exacerbated by human activities. These large spiny predators feed exclusively on coral polyps and can devastate reef systems during population outbreaks. While these starfish are native to coral reef systems, their population explosions appear to be triggered by nutrient pollution and the removal of their natural predators through overfishing. A single adult crown-of-thorns can consume several square yards of living coral per year. Invasive species, transported by ships or deliberately introduced, can disrupt atoll ecosystems in unpredictable ways. Cane toads introduced to control insects on inhabited atolls have become pests themselves, competing with native wildlife and poisoning predators that attempt to eat them. Marine invasives like certain algae species can overgrow native coral communities, while invasive fish species can displace native species that have evolved specific roles in reef ecosystems. Tourism and development, while providing economic benefits to some atoll communities, can create additional stresses on reef ecosystems. Boat anchors and groundings can physically damage coral formations that took decades or centuries to grow. Increased sedimentation from construction activities can smother coral polyps. Sewage and wastewater from resorts and urban areas can trigger algae blooms that compete with corals for space and light. Despite these challenges, conservation efforts around the world are working to protect and restore atoll ecosystems. Marine protected areas, where fishing and other extractive activities are restricted or prohibited, have shown remarkable success in allowing reef ecosystems to recover. Fish populations rebound, coral cover increases, and ecosystem resilience improves when human pressures are reduced. Coral restoration projects are developing innovative techniques to help coral communities recover from disturbances. Scientists are learning to propagate corals in nurseries, growing fragments of healthy coral in protected conditions before transplanting them to damaged reefs. Some programs focus on identifying and breeding corals that show natural resistance to warming temperatures or acidification, potentially creating more resilient reef communities. Local communities play crucial roles in atoll conservation, often serving as the most effective protectors of these ecosystems. Traditional management systems, developed over centuries of living in close relationship with reef ecosystems, offer valuable insights for modern conservation. Community-based marine protected areas, managed by local people according to traditional practices, often achieve better conservation outcomes than top-down protection schemes. Education and awareness programs help people understand the connections between local actions and global atoll health. School programs teach children about coral biology and ecosystem functions. Community workshops demonstrate how individual choices about fishing, waste disposal, and land use can affect reef health. These programs recognize that effective conservation requires the understanding and participation of people at all levels, from local communities to global policymakers. International cooperation is essential for addressing the global-scale drivers of atoll degradation. Climate change mitigation requires coordinated action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions worldwide. Pollution control requires cooperation between nations to regulate the transport of pollutants through ocean currents and atmospheric circulation. These challenges are too large for any single nation or community to address alone. Scientific research continues to reveal new aspects of atoll ecology and identify potential solutions to conservation challenges. Long-term monitoring programs track changes in coral health, fish populations, and water quality over time. Genetic studies help identify coral populations that may be naturally resistant to environmental stresses. Oceanographic research improves our understanding of how atolls respond to changing conditions. Technological innovations offer new tools for atoll conservation. Satellite monitoring can track bleaching events and other changes in real time across vast areas of ocean. Underwater robots allow scientists to study deep reef areas that are difficult for human divers to reach. Genetic techniques enable the identification of coral species and populations that may be particularly important for conservation efforts. The challenge of conserving atolls ultimately requires balancing the immediate needs of human communities with the long-term health of these remarkable ecosystems. Many atolls support human populations that depend on reef resources for food, income, and protection from storms. Effective conservation must find ways to meet human needs while maintaining the ecological processes that created and sustain these living rings of coral. Success stories from around the world demonstrate that atoll conservation is possible when communities, scientists, and governments work together. Protected areas have allowed damaged reefs to recover. Sustainable fishing practices have maintained both fish populations and fishing livelihoods. Traditional management systems have been revitalized and combined with modern scientific knowledge to create effective conservation strategies. The future of coral atolls depends on our ability to address both global and local threats, while supporting the communities that call these remarkable places home. These ancient ecosystems, which have demonstrated remarkable resilience over millions of years, still possess the potential to adapt and survive if we can reduce the pressures they face and protect the ecological processes that sustain them. As our gentle journey through the world of coral atolls draws to a close, let's drift quietly on these warm tropical currents and reflect on the remarkable story we've discovered together. In the space of one peaceful evening, we've traveled through millions of years, witnessed the birth and death of islands, and explored some of Earth's most extraordinary partnerships between living creatures. The story of coral atolls is ultimately a story about time itself, and how life learns to work with the deepest rhythms of our planet. When we think about these perfect rings of coral rising from the deep ocean, we are contemplating one of nature's most patient and persistent construction projects. Generation after generation of tiny coral polyps, each no larger than a rice grain, working together across geological ages to build structures visible from space. There's something deeply comforting in understanding that life finds ways to adapt and continue even as entire islands sink beneath the waves. The coral polyps didn't simply accept the loss of their volcanic foundation. They responded by building their own replacement, creating biological islands that could persist long after the original land disappeared. In this, they teach us profound lessons about resilience, cooperation, and the power of small actions accumulating over vast spans of time. Consider the elegant partnership between coral animals and their algae companions. A relationship that has persevered for millions of years through ice ages, volcanic eruptions, and countless environmental changes. Each tiny polyp shelters millions of even tinier plants, sharing food and shelter in an exchange so fundamental that neither partner can survive without the other. This ancient cooperation created the abundance of life we find in every coral atoll, reminding us that the most successful communities are built on mutual support and shared resources. The transformation from volcanic mountain to coral ring reveals something beautiful about the continuity of life on Earth. What appears to be an ending, the disappearance of an island beneath the waves, actually becomes a new beginning as coral communities create entirely new habitats for marine life. The lagoon that forms as the island sinks becomes a nursery for countless species, a sanctuary during storms, and a laboratory where evolution continues to experiment with new forms of cooperation and adaptation. Darwin's insight into atoll formation shows us how careful observation combined with bold thinking can unlock nature's deepest secrets. His ability to see the connection between seemingly unrelated phenomena, sinking islands and growing reefs, exemplifies the kind of holistic thinking we need to understand our complex world. The coral reefs growing upward to match their sinking foundations provided Darwin with a perfect metaphor for life's ability to respond creatively to challenges. The incredible biodiversity of atolls reminds us that complexity and beauty emerge naturally when systems are allowed to develop over sufficient time. Every niche, every microhabitat created by coral growth becomes home to specialized creatures that have evolved remarkable adaptations. The cleaner fish that advertise their services to larger fish, the parrotfish that grind coral into sand while keeping algae in check, the giant clams that farm algae in their tissues. Each represents millions of years of evolutionary fine-tuning. In the secret world of atoll lagoons, we discovered ecosystems where every grain of sand tells a story of life and death, growth and recycling. These protected waters, clear as liquid crystal and warm as tropical rain, create conditions found nowhere else on Earth. They remind us that some of nature's most precious treasures exist in places far from human observation, continuing their ancient rhythms whether we witness them or not. The challenges facing modern atolls bring our journey full circle to the present moment. These ancient systems, which survived so many changes over geological time, now face threats that move faster than their natural ability to adapt. Yet even in this challenging time, we find reasons for hope. The same forces that built atolls over millions of years, the persistence of small organisms, the power of cooperation, the ability to adapt to changing conditions, continue to operate today. The conservation efforts taking place around the world show us that humans can choose to be partners in the construction project rather than agents of destruction. When we protect marine areas from overfishing, reduce pollution, and address climate change, we're allowing the ancient processes of atoll formation to continue. We become part of the solution rather than part of the problem. Local communities that have lived with atolls for generations carry forward traditional knowledge about how these systems work and how to live in harmony with them. Their wisdom, combined with modern scientific understanding, offers paths forward that benefit both human communities and the remarkable ecosystems that sustain them. Perhaps the most profound lesson from our journey is about perspective and patience. In our fast-paced world, it's easy to become discouraged by problems that seem too large to solve. But coral atolls teach us that the most enduring solutions often require the kind of persistence that tiny coral polyps have practiced for millions of years. Small actions, repeated consistently over long periods, can literally move mountains, or in this case, build new ones from the seafloor up. As you drift toward sleep tonight, carry with you the image of those perfect coral rings scattered across the Pacific, like stepping stones between worlds. Remember that beneath each one lies the foundation of an ancient volcanic island, transformed but not lost, still supporting life in ways its original builders could never have imagined. The coral polyps working through the night, the fish sleeping in reef crevices, the gentle currents carrying nutrients and larvae between distant reefs, all continue their ancient work while we rest. In your dreams, perhaps you'll float above those impossible lagoons where the water is so clear you can see every detail of the sandy bottom far below. Maybe you'll witness the quiet miracle of coral polyps, adding one more microscopic layer to structures that have been growing since before humans walked the earth. You might find yourself swimming alongside creatures whose ancestors colonized these reefs millions of years ago, still following the same patterns of feeding, growing, and reproducing that allowed their lineages to survive ice ages and volcanic catastrophes. The story of coral atolls is far from over. These living rings continue to grow and change, adapt and persist, even as we sleep. Somewhere in the Pacific tonight, tides are flowing through reef channels, carrying fresh seawater to lagoon communities. Coral polyps are extending their tentacles to capture plankton, adding their tiny contributions to structures that future generations may still marvel at millions of years from now. Tomorrow will bring new challenges and new opportunities for these remarkable ecosystems. Scientists will continue studying their secrets, conservationists will work to protect them, and local communities will continue the ancient human tradition of learning to live in harmony with the sea. Each of us, in our own way, can contribute to ensuring that these perfect rings of life continue their patient work of building beauty and supporting abundance in the world's most remote waters. So rest peacefully tonight, knowing that in the vast Pacific, coral atolls continue their eternal dance with time and tide. They remind us that life is remarkably persistent, that cooperation creates more than any individual effort could achieve alone, and that the most beautiful things often emerge from the longest, most patient processes. In a world that often feels chaotic and uncertain, these ancient rings of coral offer us symbols of stability, resilience, and the quiet confidence that comes from being part of something much larger than ourselves. Sweet dreams, and may your sleep be as peaceful as the protected waters of an atoll lagoon, as enduring as the coral that builds new worlds from the bones of old ones, and as hopeful as the tiny polyps that continue, even now, their magnificent work of turning stone and sunlight into some of Earth's most vibrant celebrations of life. Good night.